Hello and welcome to Breaking Ground on iPropertyRadio with myself, Carol Tallon, the show where we chat to industry experts to get a view on what's happening on the ground and to learn about new trends emerging within the construction industry. The show is brought to you in partnership with Place Engage, a data-driven platform for more successful public consultation and community engagement for your next development project. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Emma Reardon, Divisional Director with Cushman Wakefield. Emma, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Carol. How are you? And very, very much delighted to be on your show today. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. So Cushman and Wakefield, one of the best known names in the industry, but you might just remind people of the main kind of sectors that you and the team work across.
Yeah, so I am a divisional director in the Dublin office in Cushman and Wakefield. Cushman and Wakefield have three offices in Ireland, so in Dublin, Cork, and Galway. The largest office is Dublin based, and I work on the investment team in the Dublin office, specialising in the living sector and predominantly student accommodation.
When you talk about the living sector, is that taking in, obviously student accommodation, because we're going to talk about that today, but also kind of the wider private rented sector, and particularly, sector kind of almost subsectors like co-living that have been quite controversial to the detriment of the marketplace.
They have indeed, actually. So I suppose within the team, we cover all PRS, student accommodation, co-living, hotels, and healthcare as well, although healthcare is mainly covered off by our Limerick office.
Very good. So maybe before we go kind of too deeply into student accommodation, talk to us about some of the trends you're seeing. Obviously, co-living has maybe been one of the controversial ones, but we're seeing that right now we're seeing schemes that had planning come to the market and be very, very well received, because there was a huge gaping gap in the market at that level. And talk to us maybe a little bit about the marketplace that you're seeing now that we have schemes coming to that are actually being filled out and being well received by consumers.
I think from an occupational point of view, the co-living buildings that have been delivered to the market so far have been very well received. There's certainly just a gap in the market to provide certain level of accommodation for people who are, say, starting off in their professional career, moving out of home, and want to find accommodation, perhaps in a city where they're moving to and aren't ready at that point to get on the property ladder. So I think co-living is. We actually call it in our student accommodation industry, it's like almost student accommodation for adults. And I think it works well for, a certain age group for those particular reasons, I believe.
And however we label it, it really does come down to kind of cost, convenience, community, and having the type of being giving people the type of lifestyle that is appropriate for them at that stage. So where we're allowing essentially a gap to open back up in the entry level of the housing market, what do you see stepping in to fill that, or what do you see for the future of that particular space?
Well, to be honest, given that at this point in time, there's no more co-living planning permissions permitted in Ireland, I think it is disappointing, to be honest, because I don't believe that, developers would have gone out and delivered co-living all over the country. It definitely would have been a good solution in a lot of key locations, especially in the city centre or within walking distance of the city centre or within a reasonable commute. So I don't believe there's a huge amount to replace what could have been delivered by co-living, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm always interested in innovation, and not just a kind of innovation on how we do things or how we deliver them, but the business model innovation that we started to see across all sectors. And when I see a gap like that, I'm always thinking about what are the next generation of innovators? What kind of solution are they going to come up with? In much the same way as we saw Airbnb essentially redefine hospitality in a way that really couldn't have been foreseen. When we leave a gap in the market like this, something is going to step in to fill it. And innovation will always be ahead of regulation. That's just how the marketplace works. So I wonder, will there come a point in time where maybe from a policy point of view, we realise that the wrong decision was made, the wrong policies were pursued, and that actually there might be a rollback on it, albeit under maybe a different guise. So I think it's an interesting space to watch. But let's talk about kind of maybe the wider PRS for a moment as well. Like what kind of trends? Because actually, again, another sector that's come under pressure in terms of financing and project owners' ability to attract international finance because of our national policies. So what are you seeing across that sector?
It's, from an investment perspective, things are very quiet in the sector, unfortunately, at the moment. And it's mainly down to the fact that there's not a huge amount of new stock to be delivered over the next year to 2 years. And really anything that has been delivered has been sold at this point or taken under a social contract. So that's really the market is very much quieting down from what we would have seen over the last number of years.
Yeah, and that's in terms of, I suppose, then the supply side. But on the demand side, is the demand still there?
Very much so, from what we're hearing on the ground. So any new deliveries of buildings and units are being let up extremely quickly. In all of the ranges of price sectors, but obviously in particular in the mid-tier sector.
It's so interesting when you're trying to, a lot of times when we talk about buildings that have been delivered, obviously it's without giving too much thought to the many years of the process that's gone in. So the policy that was existing at the time, the planning processes, and obviously while planning is hopefully on a trajectory to be rectified in some way, there isn't huge confidence around the new planning and development bill. And I suppose it hasn't been helped by the 388 amendments that have gone in before it's even enacted. But we know that planning is and has been a problem. We know there's steps to rectify it. Whether they go far enough, is a bit of a controversial question, and I think it's one without a clear answer at this stage. But when you're talking to clients and advising them, and you need to look down a few years into the future, how are you able to do that given the maybe uncertainty in terms of policy in Ireland right now?
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult one, and none of us have a crystal ball. But look, everything is pointing in the right direction, albeit it might take a while to get to a point where getting a planning permission through is within a reasonable time frame and makes it actually viable from a developer's point of view. I suppose in particular for the student sector, we've seen really a halt in any new applications of planning permissions that have gone in, and it's mainly down to really viability on for these new schemes. So that's one of the other key factors, apart from actually getting through the planning process, is whether a scheme ends up being viable.
When we look at the student accommodation sector, we have demand for student accommodation maybe outside of the main, just Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway, and indeed Waterford. Now we're seeing it with the TUs across the country and the amalgamation and the process they've gone through in recent years. And more and more and more, we're hearing these stories about students who are commuting 3 and 4 hours each way to go to college, or worse, students who are sleeping in their cars in the car park of universities. And I can only suggest they don't do that in the University of the University of Galway. I got clamped there myself last week. So there was no respite for students, in any respect. But in terms of student accommodation, you touched on it there, viability. We have demand in not just the large urban centres, but in some of the smaller urban centres as well. But project viability just is it even stretching beyond Dublin and Cork right now?
Not really. I think in the three main cities, Dublin, Cork, and Galway is possibly where you could see any new development being delivered. Outside those locations, just the nature of the cost of the rents is really making any other projects outside those city locations really unviable unless there is government assistance or the government steps in, as they are making sounds about, which is very positive for the sector overall. And possibly that they're able to provide grants in relation to the construction costs for developments on the TU campuses in Dublin and regionally as well.
Okay, and are you hopeful? I mean, I like that you positioned that things are pointing in the right direction, because I think that's a very generous approach to take in terms of policy. But no, it is good. And by the way, you know, that's not a critique. I can very much recognise that there have been some fantastic government initiatives that are genuinely starting to work. We're seeing it across Creek Cronahan and other schemes. There've been so many initiatives, and I think initially, while they might have been more kind of on the while they were designed to stimulate supply, they were kind of positioned more on the demand side, more on the consumer side. Whereas actually, I think now there's a little bit more political honesty to say that actually, no, we need more supply side initiatives, and we've seen that in the last year or two, which is really positive. But is it enough? Is it enough? Say, if we just look at the student accommodation market, is it enough to satisfy the demand that we have in the locations where we have it?
Look, there's a huge amount of beds, for instance, in the planning pipeline. But again, and they would be on the university campuses and also privately owned sites with planning permission. I think if all of those sites were developed out, possibly we could meet the current demands and the future demands. But the reality is that some of those sites that say do have planning permission mightn't actually be in locations that would make them viable. Yeah. So Carol, I think what's quite unique about the student accommodation sector in Ireland is that most of the planning permissions for the newer accommodation that have been delivered since 2016 would allow for lettings over the summer months to non-students. So what that means is that when the students finish their academic year and go home to their family home or back to their own country, wherever it may be, then the operator of the scheme is allowed to let those bedrooms for tourist use over the summer months. So from a viability perspective, that's actually a positive opportunity from a revenue point of view over those summer months. So if the scheme is run efficiently, you can operate quite a good summer model, and effectively on a per night basis, you're able to achieve more on a revenue basis per bed space than you would be over the academic year period. And that's in contrast to what we see across in UK and Europe. So a lot of the accommodation in most of the cities, the student cities in those locations, would be operating on very low occupancy levels over the summer and wouldn't have that type of planning permission available to them.
That sounds like a very positive kind of distinguishing factor in the Irish marketplace then, because obviously I can see two major benefits to the consumer, essentially, that obviously you're not trying to, or you don't need to make 12 months revenue in 9 months. So therefore it shouldn't be attracting as high costs because you're able to build that summer season into your revenue model. But also I would imagine that impacts the finish. If you know that, yes, you've students 9 months of the year, and then you have to be of a standard that tourists will choose this as well, is that impacting maybe the quality of finish or any of the design choices?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And I think overall for those kind of buildings, you have to factor in or have durable design and finishes and fit out, etc., to the rooms and to the building. Yes, it's a positive on that from that perspective, but again, very much stemmed down to where the actual accommodation is located. So if you're in a location that's within walking distance of the city centre, you're probably going to be in a position where you can operate a successful summer model. However, if you're in a more suburban location, then it's much harder, obviously, to sell those beds for tourists, because tourists obviously typically tend to be wanting to stay closer to the city centre. I suppose then the negative to that kind of business model would be the higher wear and tear, as you pointed out there, on the building if you're turning over the beds quite frequently over the summer months, and then obviously the additional costs that would be associated with running this hotel type model. So obviously you have to bring in a set of new staff over the summer months to turn over the rooms, to operate the reception area, and then obviously you would have additional costs in terms of linen costs and other costs associated with running marketing and running a hotel type model. So it's not for every operator, but it is interesting to see that for specific located student accommodation schemes, a lot of them can run quite a successful business model.
Yeah, when we look at the business model, I can see over the last decade there has almost been a merging of what we might have considered to be the offering across the private rented sector, including student accommodation and for hospitality. I mean, space as a service is, I think as the real estate industry has become really comfortable transitioning and recognizing itself as a service provider as opposed to a building provider over the last decade, and obviously that's very welcome. But I'm thinking of when we look at the quality of fit out and amenities, the range of amenities. I'm thinking of the headlines that we read every year when students are going back to college about the very high standard of student accommodation and the amenities and the gyms and the cinemas on site. So that crossover from student into hospitality doesn't feel very far removed. The quality of student accommodation in Ireland is excellent.
It is. And I suppose because really the market has really evolved since, I suppose, 2016. Prior to that, what was student accommodation? It was essentially apartment style accommodation that would have been you might have kind of 3 or 4 bedrooms within those typical apartments, or usually en suite, and a lot of these buildings would have been built as part of tax incentives over the last kind of 15 or 20 years, and would be obviously much older accommodation. And then really kind of from 2016 onwards came the newer modern purpose-built accommodation, and we started to see these fantastic buildings being delivered with amenity space in addition to obviously the bedrooms. So a lot of the buildings today, typically the newer stock would not only provide an ensuite bedroom to the students, there would be within that apartment or cluster, as it's known in the industry, you would have some shared living space as well. So the students, you might have anything from kind of a 4 to an 8 bed cluster apartment, and within that then you have your shared kitchen, living space and dining space. And then in addition to the shared living space, typically on the ground floor there will be additional amenities provided to the students. So what's typical is we see a common room or a games room. You might have a table tennis table or pool table, lounge area, and then in addition to that, study space, private study rooms or communal or group study rooms, which students could book out as a group, or just book out themselves if they were practicing a presentation, etc. And then in some of the higher end schemes, we've seen things like communal kitchen spaces, which again tends to go down very well from a student point of view, where a group of students again can book out the communal kitchen space and host a dinner party, and then other such amenities. We have seen in one particular scheme a bowling alley.
Wow.
So again, it sounds very fancy, but I suppose all of the amenities are really designed to bring the student out of their room and down into the social space where they can interact and meet new people, make new friends, and it's all part of the student experience. I think typically in most markets, particularly in Dublin, there would be a very high proportion of international students who would avail of the accommodation in the cities. So we'd see maybe typically around 80 to 85% of the students would be international. And again, if you're coming to the city, into Dublin, Cork or Galway for the first time, it's you're very much, you might know anyone, so it's very much a social life that's there and ready for you. In addition to your room, your bed, your bedding, your kitchenware, and then again, the staff who would be located on site would be trained to provide pastoral care to the students. It's very much a community environment.
And the element of community, and I don't want to kind of go back to talking about co-living, but you did say that it was referred to almost as student accommodation for adults. And actually, I think the common thread there is that sense of community, and that is what people choose at many stages of their life. When you talk about the student experience, it's feeling very far removed from the student experience I had when you talk about bowling alleys and dinner parties. I didn't know any students who were throwing dinner parties, but I think there might be a more sophisticated student today than back in my day. But actually, when we're talking about the quality of finish, I'm looking at one that Cushman and Wakefield are bringing to the market now, and it's open for bookings for September 24. Scape. That's a stunning building. You might just tell us a little more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've just launched the sale of Scape Dublin. It's a 298-bed student accommodation scheme located on Ainger Street in Dublin 2. So the scheme was delivered in 2020 and has been operating for the last 3 years. It's in its third year of operation. Look, it's an absolute gem in the heart of the city, where Pearl, as we've named it, Project Pearl, in the heart of the city. Really a stone's throw from Grafton Street, and most importantly from two universities that would have a high proportion of international students. So that would be the Royal College of Surgeons Ireland and Trinity College Dublin. So it's on Ainger Street, and it's very much an oasis in the middle of the city in terms of the kind of community environment that's provided to the students within that building. So within the building, there's a gym that would be open 24 hours for the students, and then there's a clubhouse style pavilion which is located on the first floor, which has amenities such as a communal kitchen, study areas, private study rooms, and kind of a general hangout area for the students. And that opens onto a courtyard garden, which again is really unique because it's in the middle of the city centre, but a really private courtyard garden, which again the students can hang out in. There's garden seating, etc. there, and provided for the students as well. So
very good. And I mean, the location is second to none. So, you were talking about kind of the summer season. If you're within walking distance of the city, you simply couldn't get any closer to St. Stephen's Green. So in terms of the type of market you're attracting, or even the type of inquiries, or, who are you seeing kind of looking at this and paying attention to this right now?
Well, one point to correct there, if you don't mind going back. So it's just in relation to this scheme. The model that it operates on is it's a 51-week letting model. So when I spoke about it earlier, there was planning permissions for a lot of the schemes around Dublin that would allow for tourist lets. Some of the operators, if they have very strong international demand, they're starting to offer lettings on a 51-week basis as well. So that's an interesting kind of theme, and that seems to be that is evolving in the student sector currently in Ireland at the moment. And so the RCSI has actually a nomination agreement, which is effectively like a lease agreement, and they have taken beds in the Scape building for 51 weeks each year, and that the building has been sold on that basis. So look, we've just launched the sale of Scape this week, so it's early days in the process. We haven't seen a disposal or a transaction of student accommodation in the Dublin market for the last 2 years. So it was kind of the end of 2021, 2022 when the last portfolio traded. So it's been obviously very quiet on the ground for the obvious reasons around finance and inflation. So we have already seen lots of interest, over the last few days, and that was something that we had obviously anticipated. And I suppose just in terms of overall, what are investors looking at? There's a lot more soundings around the living sector and indeed the student accommodation beds. Huge amount of interest for a number of different reasons. Obviously, demographics is a huge amount to play in things in terms of supply and demand, and the constant increase in student numbers domestically and internationally. So effectively, every building across Ireland currently is operating at maximum capacity or full occupancy, as we would call it in the sector. So yes, it's exciting. It is the best. It's the best building, we think, in Dublin and Ireland, and we'd be very confident that the sales process is going to go well. And as I said already, we've seen lots of interest. So
very good. And I suppose without pushing you too much further, are you expecting this to go to an Irish or international?
I would imagine likely it's going to be an international investor.
Okay, and just I suppose in terms of inquiries, not necessarily around this particular property, but others that are coming in from international buyers, are you picking up on any trends? Obviously, the last few years, each year has brought their own unique challenges for the real estate market, and Ireland is certainly not alone in experiencing that. But what are the Irish specific concerns that international investors have for 2024 and 2025?
Yeah, I think from an international perspective, from an international investor looking at Ireland, rent caps, that's probably one of the biggest barriers at the moment to investors. So student market came under the RTB legislation about over 2 years ago now. So effectively, all the student rents are capped at 2%. So compared to other markets across Europe, if you're comparing markets, that's probably one of the biggest barriers currently to investment.
Okay, and look, obviously we know from various different groups, whether it's PII and others, and in fact, even as recently as the IMF coming into Ireland in November and talking about how damaging rent caps are and how they have the opposite effect to what the government seems to think it has. We know that that's a policy that needs to change and it's one that's being looked at. But is there any reason to be optimistic that we could be looking at a change kind of over the next 24 to 36 months?
Look, for the sector, obviously we would hope so. But the reality is we're probably going to see it in a different form or fashion, and potentially more in the form of income supports, as opposed to lifting of the rental caps on the sector, unfortunately. So,
and it's interesting, that is almost the very opposite to what the IMF was recommending. In fact, they recommended specific targeted supports for people experiencing affordability issues as opposed to rent caps in the market, because we know that it impacts the supply. It impacts negatively the existing supply and the supply of new homes, while demand fires ahead in terms of levels growing. So yeah, it's a difficult one to understand the rationale behind. But listen, thank you so much for taking the time to take us through that today. I will, of course, share the link to Scape. It is a stunning building, superbly well located, with an established operations in place there. So thank you so much for taking us through that. That was Emma Reardon, Divisional Director with Cushman Wakefield. My thanks to show producer Katie Tallon and to the production team at Hear Me Roar Media. Also, my thanks to Place Engage for making these conversations possible, and to you for tuning in. Please check out all of the other Irish and international real estate and construction shows here on iPropertyRadio.com.